Hey, five-star scandal, a dead sous chef, and Wolfe smells more than truffle oil. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Let me know, where in the world are you listening from? Your thoughts always bring these mysteries alive. Let's begin. You know things are about to go off the rails when Fritz Brenner, who treats the Brownstones' kitchen like a priest tends an altar, slams a pot hard enough to rattle the saucepans. I was in the front room, half reclined with the day's Gazette, when the metallic clatter came booming down the hall like a warning shot. I folded the paper and got moving, fast but not reckless, no point in setting off Wolfe's seismic detectors upstairs. As I hit the kitchen doorway, there was Fritz, pink-cheeked, eyes glassy behind his specs, with a letter clutched like he might throw it into the oven. "Archie," he barked, which was like hearing a lamb growl. You must get Mr. Wolfe." Now, Fritz doesn't make demands. If the place was on fire, he'd first ask if you'd like your toast buttered. So I gave it the weight it deserved. "Easy, Fritz," I said, stepping in. "What's the trouble? Did someone rate your duck à l'orange only 4 stars? He shook the letter at me like it had insulted his ancestors. "It's Mr. Florian. He's in terrible trouble. He needs help." I took the letter and skimmed it. Florian Descole was a name. I knew mostly because Fritz mentioned him every time he got wistful about the golden era of New York cuisine. Florian had been a head chef at the prestigious Brasserie La Motte, a place that made you mortgage your conscience for a dinner reservation. The letter was brief, frantic, and, if you knew how to read between the lines, desperate. "Dear Fritz, you once said if I ever needed something I could count on you. I've run out of friends who believe me. I need help, quiet, intelligent help, and you're the only man I trust to know who to ask. I didn't do what they say, but if I don't clear my name soon, I'll lose everything. Please, if you can, please come, or send someone who can make people listen. Florian." I finished reading, exhaled, and looked up. Fritz was standing there like he was waiting for his final judgment. "All right," I said. "I'll talk to the big man. No promises." I didn't have to wonder whether Wolfe would be interested. On a normal day, getting him to lift a pinky for anyone outside the building was harder than teaching a cat to play the violin. But this wasn't just anyone. This was Fritz's white whale. I found Wolfe upstairs in the plant rooms, where he was holding a delicate orchid bloom up to the light, like a jeweler with a rare gem. I waited at the threshold until he noticed me, which took about the same amount of patience you'd need to watch grass grow in January. At last, Wolfe grunted. "What, Archie?" "Letter came for Fritz, from an old friend. He's in a mess, serious kind. Wants help." Wolfe lowered the bloom and gave me a look like I'd asked him to go ice skating. "You may assure Fritz," he said, "that our profession has regrettable boundaries. I am neither advocate nor avenger. He's in the kitchen, ready to have a heart attack," I said. "And this Florian fella, it's not a stranger. It's a guy Fritz thinks walks on water. Might be worth at least hearing out before you decree his doom." Wolfe snorted, but he wasn't made of stone. He wiped his hands, heavy and deliberate, on a linen towel. "Bring the letter," he said. "And Fritz." If I'd had a camera, I would have taken a picture of that moment. Fritz hustling into Wolfe's office like a kid summoned to the principal, letter trembling in hand, and Wolfe glowering from behind his desk, already calculating whether this interruption would be worth a dent in his schedule or his dignity. Fritz poured it all out. Florian's fall from grace, the accusations, something about kitchen sabotage and theft, the sense that enemies were ganging up on him. Wolfe listened, fingertips pressed together, expression neutral. When Fritz finished, panting slightly, Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, clear and cutting. "You will telephone Mr. Descole," he said. "Invite him here tomorrow noon." Fritz sagged in relief. I didn't bother asking why Wolfe had agreed. He wouldn't say, "Not yet," but I made a private note. Anything that cracked the walls of the brownstone without Wolfe throwing a tantrum meant the stakes were bigger than Fritz's friendship, and I had a feeling this case was going to leave more than the kitchen in a mess. The next morning, I did my usual tour of duty, breakfast with one eye on the kitchen, another on the front door. Fritz was jittery enough to sprinkle sugar into the salt jar if you didn't watch him. Wolfe didn't appear until 11, as scheduled, descending the stairs like a grumpy deity forced to walk among mortals. At noon sharp, the bell rang. I got up, made sure the chain was set, and opened the door just wide enough to get a look. Florian Descol was not what I expected. I had pictured a towering Gallic artisan, maybe sporting a toque and the faint smell of cognac. Instead, he was average height, neat, narrow-shouldered, with the tense face of a man who'd been dodging accusations like baseballs at a batting cage. His hair was prematurely grey at the temples, and his coat, a beautifully cut navy number, hung him a little loose. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice low and rough like a chef's knife over a whetstone. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Don't touch anything you can't afford to replace." He managed a ghost of a smile and stepped into the foyer. His eyes darted everywhere, walls, carpet, ceiling, like he was entering a temple where one wrong move would get him cursed. "Wait here," I told him, and headed back to Wolfe's office. "Client's here," I announced. "Shall I usher or parade?" "Bring him," Wolfe said, without opening his eyes. He was in his chair, hands spread on the armrests, a picture of disdainful patience. I fetched Florian and guided him into the office. He froze a second at the threshold, no doubt sensing the territorial charge in the air. Everyone who entered, the brownstone for business, felt it, that slight but undeniable feeling that you were prey on another creature's land. "Mr. Descol," Wolfe said without moving. "Sit." Florian perched on the edge of the red leather chair as if it might eject him. Wolfe stared at him a long moment. I settled in my chair, crossed my legs, and prepared to take mental notes. "You wrote to Mr. Brenner," Wolfe said. "You are in trouble." "Yes," Florian said. "Very serious trouble." Wolfe inclined his head the tiniest degree. "A concession. Proceed." Florian took a breath. 3 weeks ago, I was asked to take over as executive chef at the Lamotte again, temporarily. Their regular man, André Roux, had a family emergency. I agreed because the owner, Mrs. Greta Lamotte, insisted it would only be for 2 months. He paused, as if gauging Wolfe's interest. Wolfe said nothing. Florian pressed on. "Last week, after a very high-profile event, an anniversary gala for the Board of Regents, one of the major donors fell violently ill. There was an immediate investigation, and the conclusion—" He swallowed. "The meal was tampered with, sabotaged." "Food poisoning?" I asked. "Not precisely. No pathogen was found. It was an additive, a chemical agent. Tasteless, odorless, but dangerous. It was traced to a rare spice blend, one I used." Wolfe's eyes opened. "And you deny culpability?" Wolfe said, more a statement than a question. "I swear it," Florian said fiercely. "I would never, could never do such a thing. But the evidence points to me. The spice blend was kept in a locked cabinet. Only 3 people had access. And of those 3, I'm the one with the supposed motive, an old grudge against Mrs. Lamotte's late husband." I caught the flicker there, Florian's lip tightening just for a second. "Grudge? That sounded tasty. Motive, or not," Wolfe said coolly. "The accusation alone could end your career." "It already has," Florian said flatly. "I'm suspended, blacklisted." "And what is it you wish of me?" Florian sat straighter, clutching the arms of his chair. "Find out who did this. Prove it wasn't me. Or at least uncover enough truth that Mrs. Lamotte reconsiders before filing charges." Wolfe leaned back, pressing his fingertips together. He looked like a sultan considering a particularly ragged petitioner. "Tell me," Wolfe said, "who are the other 2 with cabinet access?" Florian hesitated. "The sous chef, Danielle Vance, and the restaurant manager Henry Tuck. And you suspect? I don't know, Florian said miserably. But someone set me up, that much I know. Wolfe closed his eyes again, thinking I knew the signs. He wasn't rejecting the case, but he wasn't jumping into it either. He was weighing it like a butcher with a side of beef. Finally, Wolfe spoke. Mr. Descole, I will consider accepting your engagement provisionally. Mr. Goodwin will visit Brasserie Lamotte. He will observe, inquire, and collect impressions, after which I shall determine whether your cause merits further investment. Florian nodded, sagging with relief. Wolfe's lips curved in what for him passed as a grim smile. And be advised, he added softly, I am not in the business of rescuing the guilty from the consequences of their folly. If you have omitted truths, confess now. Florian's eyes hardened. I swear, I am innocent. Wolfe grunted. We shall see. I escorted Florian to the door. He thanked me in a voice that sounded like sandpaper, and I watched him disappear down the steps, a thin, lonely figure against the bright, bustling city. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already reaching for the bell to summon Fritz for beer. Bring your notebook tomorrow, Wolfe told me without looking up. Wear something you can eat in without offending the help. Another day, another fancy restaurant, I said. It's a hard life, but someone's got to suffer it. He snorted, but behind that snort I could tell something about this case was already simmering under Nero Wolfe's skin, and the kitchen wasn't the only place something was about to burn. Excellent. Thanks for the clarification. The next morning, I sharpened my best pencils, polished my shoes until they could double as signal mirrors, and pulled a clean notebook from the desk drawer. Wolfe didn't skimp on tools if they served the work, and a good notebook had saved us more times than a gun ever could. At 11:30 sharp, I slid behind the wheel of the Heron sedan, pointed the hood downtown, and headed toward the Brasserie Lamotte. The Brasserie was tucked into a block of brown marble and glass on East 52nd, a place where the flowers out front got better haircuts than most people. I parked, straightened my tie, and strolled up the steps into an air-conditioned wash of French jazz and the soft clink of cutlery. Inside, the maitre d', a wafer-thin man with a moustache that looked glued on, gave me a once-over that could have wilted steel. Reservation? He asked, as if daring me to say no. I handed him one of Wolfe's cards, plain ivory, heavy enough to double as a paperweight. He looked at it, eyebrows climbing. Ah, you are Mr. Goodwin? In the flesh, I said. Florian Descole sent word ahead. I'm here to look around, not to disturb the soufflés. He gave me a tight nod and gestured for a waitress to approach. This is Margot. She will assist you. Margot was mid-20s, all auburn hair and green eyes, with the no-nonsense air of a woman who'd had her share of patrons snapping fingers at her. She led me to a small table near the kitchen door, prime eavesdropping real estate, and handed me a menu the size of a legal brief. Take your time, she said, the corners of her mouth flickering upward. The chef sends his compliments, I ordered. Coffee and a croissant to avoid attracting suspicion by sitting empty-handed, then settled in to survey the terrain. First target, Danielle Vance, the sous chef. Florian's letter had mentioned her as one of the three with access to the spice cabinet. From my seat, I caught glimpses through the kitchen door. A slim woman with dark hair knotted at the nape, moving like she had invisible rails under her. Shoes, controlled, efficient, barking a quick order at a junior cook without raising her voice. It took a certain kind of nerve to run a kitchen brigade, and from the way the crew jumped, Danielle had it. Second on my list, Henry Tuck, the restaurant manager. He was a presence immediately, broad-shouldered, immaculately groomed, hovering near the bar like a hawk circling a rabbit warren. His suit was cut to impress, and his smile never reached his eyes. I watched him steer an elderly couple to a prime, Table with the oily ease of a man used to controlling a room down to the last teaspoon. Third, by accident more than plan, Greta Lamotte herself, the owner. She swept in halfway through my second cup of coffee, wrapped in a silk dress worth more than my car. Mid-50s, hair a frosted helmet, face pulled tight in all the right places. She didn't so much walk as glide, with 2 assistants trailing, her like ducklings. She barely glanced at the diners before disappearing into an office off the bar. There were others, of course, the line cooks, the pastry chef, the sommelier, the army of servers. But from what Florian had said, the real action was with the big 3, Danielle, Henry and Greta. I finished my coffee, made a few idle notes and caught Margot's eye. "Busy place," I said as she cleared my plate. "I imagine tempers run high sometimes." She smiled politely. "It's a kitchen, sir. You haven't lived until you've seen someone throw a pan at someone else's head." "Anyone throw one lately?" She hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "There's been tension," she said carefully, "since Mr. Descole's trouble started. Some people think he's innocent, others—" She broke off with a little shrug. "Who's on which side?" I asked. Margot leaned in slightly. "Danielle's loyal. She worked under Mr. Descole before. But Henry—" She glanced toward the bar where Henry was laughing too loud at something a customer said. "Henry's siding with Mrs. Lamotte, publicly anyway." "And privately?" She smiled again, a little more genuine. "Around here, loyalty is whatever. Gets you your next paycheck." I left her a tip big enough to buy forgiveness if needed, and headed toward the office door, timing it just right to catch Greta Lamotte's exit. She spotted me instantly. A stranger's face stood out around here, and her eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" she asked crisply. I smiled like I had all day. "Archie Goodwin. I'm doing a little independent checking on Mr. Descole's behalf, strictly unofficial." "Mr. Descole," she said, as if the name left a bad taste. "He should worry less about unofficial investigations and more about finding a lawyer." "If he's guilty," I said lightly. She crossed her arms. "The evidence speaks for itself." "Humor me," I said. "Any theories? How the sabotage happened?" Her lip curled. "He's a bitter man, Mr. Goodwin. He was passed over years ago when my husband chose someone else to run the Lamotte kitchens permanently. Some grudges don't fade." "But you'd still bring him back." Her eyes glittered. "A temporary inconvenience. He was a concession. My late husband's friends begged me." "Regretting it?" "I regret nothing," she said, and swept away without waiting for a goodbye. On my way out, I made a quick detour around the back, noting the service entrance, the loading dock, the trash bins. The rear door lock looked new, shiny steel against weathered wood. Interesting. Either someone had broken in, or someone expected someone to. At 2:30 sharp, I was back at the brownstone. Wolfe was in the office, buried behind a pyramid. Of paperwork, but he lifted a hand for silence the second I entered. I waited, notebook ready, until he finished signing something with a vicious flourish. "Report," he said. I gave him the rundown. The suspects, the vibes, the conversations, Margot's comment about loyalties shifting like weather vanes, Greta Lamotte's little snarl of a goodbye. Wolfe listened, eyes half closed, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he tapped a finger on the armrest. "3 with opportunity," he said. "1 with grudge. 2 with visible self-interest. Good. We have fertile ground." "You think the sabotage was internal?" I asked. He opened his eyes fully now. "Sabotage that precisely tailored is not the work of random enemies. It is the art of those with intimate knowledge. And you think Florian's clean?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he murmured, "The poison is not always in the pot, Archie. Sometimes it is in the ambition that seasons the dish," which in Wolf-speak meant, "Trust no one yet." He rang for beer. I pulled out my notes and began organizing them into neat little suspect profiles. Outside, the city boiled and buzzed. Inside, the brownstone cooled into silence again. But the kitchen, fires, those were just getting started. If there's one thing Nero Wolfe drilled into me harder than a 6-course menu, it's that a man's true nature rarely announces itself in the drawing room. You get the truth. Maybe not the truth he knows, but the truth he is. Only by watching him work, watching him when he thinks no one important is looking. So Thursday morning, I got back into the Heron and set out on phase 2. Separate the suspects from their facades. First up, Danielle Vance, the sous chef. I figured she'd be easier to approach on neutral ground than trying to catch her between orders at the brasserie. A little phone work had told me she lived in a modest walk-up in Hell's Kitchen, 4th floor, over a bodega that specialized in expired candy and extremely suspicious cold cuts. I buzzed her door and waited. After a pause long enough to check my watch, I heard cautious footsteps and the bolt slide back. Danielle Vance looked the same as she had in the kitchen, taut, capable, untrusting. She wore jeans and a hoodie, hair still tightly tied back as if letting it down would cost her some tactical advantage. "Yes," she said. I smiled my best, harmless smile. "Archie Goodwin, Private Investigations. I'm looking into Florian Descole's situation. Thought you might be willing to chat." She hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. "Off the clock," I said. "No notes, no tape recorder. You can even kick me out if I ask anything too nosy." That got the faintest flicker of amusement. She stepped aside to let me in. The apartment was neat, clean, and absolutely personality-free, like a hotel room someone had moved into an hour ago. No photos, no knickknacks, no evidence of a life outside stainless steel and white tile. We sat at a tiny table near the window. She crossed her arms and watched me like a cat wondering whether I was worth killing. "Let's start simple," I said. "Florian, good chef?" "The best," she said without hesitation. "Demanding, brutal sometimes, but better than anyone else who stood behind the pass at La Motte's." "Any enemies?" She shrugged. "He had standards. Some people resent that. Specifically," she looked away for a moment, "Henry Tuck. They hated each other, always polite in front of guests, but behind the scenes, pure venom." I leaned in. "Any idea why?" Danielle gave a dry little laugh. "Tuck likes control. Florian doesn't give it. Could Tuck have framed him?" She hesitated again, a shade longer than before. "I don't know," she said finally. "But if it came down to a choice between justice and profits, Tuck would choose profits. Every time." I logged that away. "What about Greta Lamotte?" Her face stiffened. "Mrs. Lamotte tolerates chefs the way a racehorse owner tolerates jockeys. Necessary but replaceable." Sounds warm. She almost smiled. I changed tack. "Where were you the night of the gala?" "In the kitchen. Running service." Her voice sharpened slightly. "You can check the logs. Every order, every dish, signed off by me." I nodded. "I will." She stood, signaling the interview was over. I thanked her and let myself out. 1 down, 2 to go. Henry wasn't exactly hiding. I found him at Lamotte's, overseeing a staff meeting. I caught him afterward as he stepped outside for a smoke. The kind you pretend isn't really an addiction. He spotted me immediately. His jaw tightened, but he plastered on a professional smile. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "Still poking around?" "Still breathing," I said. "Mind if I ask a few?" "By all means, though you'll excuse me if I don't hold your coat." He lit the cigarette with a silver lighter and exhaled smoke like a dragon at half speed. "Thoughts on Florian?" I asked. Henry studied the horizon for a long moment. "Brilliant chef. Difficult man. Vindictive when crossed." "Crossed how?" Henry flicked ash into the gutter. "He thought Lamotte owed him the world. Promotion, loyalty, blind adoration. When it didn't come, he turned sour. I tilted my head. Sounds personal. It was, Henry said flatly. He blamed Mrs. Lamotte for decisions her husband made. Held a grudge for years. You don't have to look far for a motive, Mr. Goodwin. It's spelled in big red letters. And you? He smiled thinly. I keep my grudges off the menu. That new back door lock, I said casually. Why? He blinked. A tell. Security upgrade, he said. Quickly. We've had incidents, homeless break-ins, vandalism, standard precaution. Before or after Florian's trouble started, he hesitated just long enough to confirm the real answer. After. I let that stew a moment, thanked him, and strolled off before he could gather his defenses. She hadn't invited me back, but Wolfe wasn't a man to wait for formal invitations, and neither was I. I parked outside her townhouse and rang the bell. One of the ducklings answered, a slim young woman with tired eyes. Mrs. Lamotte is resting, she said frostily. Tell her it's about Florian Descole, I said, and that if she's smart, she'll want the next conversation private. It took 5 minutes of waiting in a marble and glass antechamber before Greta appeared. Wrapped in a velvet robe that probably cost more than a semester at Yale, she didn't bother with pleasantries. What do you want now? To understand why a woman so intent on burying Florian Descole would ever have hired him back in. The first place, she tilted her chin, because, Mr. Goodwin, the brasserie needed a name to stay in the paper, and Florian, for all his flaws, still has a name. And now that name is Mud. Convenient. She stiffened. I have no interest in smearing him for sport. No, just business. She said nothing, which said plenty. I let silence stretch until it got awkward, then stood. One more thing, I said. You're sure the contamination came from Florian's cabinet? Positive. We had the kitchen inspected by a private firm. And you trust their conclusion? Her eyes narrowed. More than I trust the word of a disgraced chef. I tipped my hat and left, carrying away a mental note. Greta Lamotte was fighting for something bigger than pride. Power, reputation, money, all. 3, maybe. I returned to the brownstone at dusk, notebook full, shoes worn thin, mind spinning. In Wolfe's office he was waiting with a fresh beer and a blank notepad. Well, he said. I delivered the day's findings like a waiter presenting. The bill. Wolfe listened, nodding slightly here, scowling there. When I finished, he steepled his fingers. 3 individuals, he said softly, with motive, means, and mendacity. All 3 could have done it, I said. None of them have alibis strong enough to cut steel. He smiled faintly. Precisely. Therefore, Archie, we shall compel them to demonstrate guilt or innocence done by their own hands. And how, I asked, do you plan to do that? Wolfe's smile deepened into something almost sinister, by giving them an irresistible opportunity to betray themselves. I leaned back, feeling the first real shiver of anticipation. This wasn't just going to be an investigation, it was going to be a trap. Wolfe's idea of a trap was never the slam-bang kind where a suspect fell into a net and screamed their confession for the cameras. No, his traps were the slow, silent, inevitable kind, like a chess game where the fool only realized he was mated after the last pawn shuffled into place. That night, over a heavy dinner of lamb shanks and barley pilaf, Wolfe laid out the beginnings of his strategy between mouthfuls. We must provoke anxiety, he said, stabbing a fork toward his plate for emphasis. Force the culprit to act prematurely. I raised an eyebrow. Easier said than done, especially if they think the case is sewn up nice and tight. He grunted. Then we shall give the appearance of a thread being pulled loose. You will suggest delicately that evidence has surfaced which could vindicate Mr. Descole. And how do I do that? I asked. Skywriting? No, Wolfe said, dabbing his mouth. You will. Leak the information. Get a gathering. I set down my fork. You're throwing a party? A tasting, Wolfe corrected, with a tone that suggested murder was preferable to dancing. I shall have Fritz prepare a selection of dishes inspired by Lamotte's menu. We shall invite the principals. Casual atmosphere, open discussion, the illusion of informality. I almost laughed out loud. Wolfe doing casual was like an elephant doing ballet, but the idea had teeth. If you think you can lure them here, I said, I'll make the call sheets. They will come, Wolfe said. They cannot afford not to. And he was right. Once I made a few well-placed phone calls, mentioning Wolfe's interest, his reputation, and a hint that Florian might have a secret ally in the investigation, the RSVPs came faster than champagne corks on New Year's. Danielle Vance agreed immediately, her voice tight but willing. Henry Tuck was cautious, but curiosity got the better of him. Greta Lamotte took the longest, but in the end she consented, though her assistant warned me she would not stay long and would not tolerate impertinent questions, which, in translation, meant tread carefully or risk getting iced out. The next 2 days were a blur of preparations. Fritz worked himself into a righteous frenzy, dusting off recipes from Lamotte's golden years. The brownstone's dining room was scrubbed and polished until it gleamed like a ship's galley before inspection. Wolfe, meanwhile, occupied himself with lists, ingredients, menus, seating charts, because the devil, as always, lived in the details. Saturday. Evening arrived cool and crisp, a blessing for early spring in New York. The guests were scheduled for 7 o'clock. I wore my best charcoal suit and practiced my casual lies in the mirror. Yes, it's just a friendly gathering. No, we're not investigating anyone tonight. Of course you can trust Mr. Wolfe. By 6:50 the brownstone was ready, chairs placed with surgical precision around the dining room, canapes lined up like soldiers, Wolfe's personal bottle, say a vintage Riesling breathing in the corner. At 7:03, because none of these people could be punctual if their lives depended on it, the bell rang. I answered it to find Henry Tuck first, sleek and smiling, in a jacket sharp enough to shave with. He handed over a bottle of wine like it was a peace offering and gave me a thin-lipped grin. "Charmed," he said, glancing around the entryway. "Your home is quaint." "Careful," I said cheerfully. "Some of the walls here bite." Behind him, Danielle. Vance arrived looking composed but jumpy around the edges. She wore a simple black dress and carried no purse, a subtle signal she didn't trust leaving valuables unattended. Greta Lamotte swept in last, all stiff elegance and brittle smiles, escorted by her assistant, a slim young man who looked terrified. To be anywhere outside the office, I ushered them into the dining room, where Wolfe sat waiting like a spider at the center of a very complicated web. He rose, miracle of miracles, to greet Greta Lamotte with a curt nod, then subsided back into his chair with the heavy grace of a collapsing monument. Once the guests were seated, Fritz appeared with the first round of hors d'oeuvres, delicate gougères stuffed with gruyere, tiny quail egg tartlets dusted with truffle salt, and spiced lamb skewers drizzled with pomegranate reduction. If Fritz had nerves, he didn't show it. He served each plate with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence. The conversation started stiff, as these things do, polite murmurs about the weather, the traffic, the perennial failure of New York's sanitation department. I waited, biding my time, until the first glass of wine loosened tongues. Then I dropped the first breadcrumb. "Funny thing," I said casually to Danielle, "how sometimes kitchen sabotage leaves traces even after a deep clean." Her head snapped around. "Traces?" I smiled. "Yeah. Chemical residues, tool marks, sometimes even fingerprints. Amazing what shows up under proper inspection." Henry Tuck shifted in his seat. Greta's eyes narrowed. "I suppose," Tuck said lightly, "that's why real investigations are left to professionals. True, I said, but amateurs stumble over truths, sometimes just by being in the way. Wolfe coughed, a sound of polite disapproval, but said nothing. His face was unreadable. I saw it then, the ripple of discomfort that ran through the group like a dropped stone in a still pond. Someone here was sweating inside their tailored clothes. Good. After dessert, an absurdly perfect pear tart that Fritz should have gotten a standing ovation for, Wolfe rose, signaling the end of the official festivities. Thank you, he said gravely. Your company has been most enlightening. A nice phrase, enlightening. Left enough space for everyone to wonder exactly what had been revealed. One by one they left, trailing goodbyes like reluctant perfume. Henry lingered a fraction longer than necessary, offering Wolfe a fake smile. If you do uncover anything, he said, I trust you'll alert the proper authorities. Wolfe inclined his head just enough to be ambiguous. When the door finally shut behind them, Wolfe remained silent, gazing at the empty plates like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. You saw it too, I said. He nodded. One of them fears exposure imminently. Which one? Wolfe tapped a finger on the chair arm. We shall know soon. Fear provokes action, and action leaves fingerprints more telling than the most diligent detective. He stood slowly, the weariness of effort heavy on him, and moved to the office. As I turned out the lights and began tidying up, something niggled at me. Maybe it was the way Henry had kept checking his watch. Maybe it was the way Danielle had refused a second glass of wine, lips pressed tight as if holding back more than just words. Or maybe it was Greta, with that acid gleam in her eyes, as if daring us to prove her wrong. Whatever it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And judging by the way Wolfe was already dictating a list of names for Saul Panzer to trail come morning, we were about to dig a little deeper, because something had already gone missing. We just didn't know it yet. Sunday dawned grey and sullen, like the city itself was nursing a hangover. In the brownstone, breakfast was served precisely at 9, soft-boiled eggs, wheat toast, and a silence so thick it might have required a chainsaw to cut through. Wolfe was deep in contemplation, forking his egg with absent-minded precision. I, meanwhile, was chewing over something less digestible, the growing sense that our cosy little tasting had stirred up more trouble than we'd realized. At 10:30, the disruption arrived. The bell rang. Hard, urgent, like someone hammering, a fist against fate. I opened the door to find Saul Panzer, hat tipped back, trench coat dusted with rain. Without preamble, he handed me an envelope. For Wolfe, he said. You want the oral too? Of course, I said, stepping aside to let him in. We moved to the office, where Wolfe had already positioned himself behind his desk, like a judge preparing for sentencing. Saul dropped into a chair and got to business. I tailed Tuck after your soiree, he said. Routine stuff until about midnight. And then, Wolfe rumbled. And then, Saul said, he made a detour, stopped by a storage unit in Long Island City, spent 15 minutes inside, came out carrying nothing. But he looked lighter, if you know what I mean. Relieved, Wolfe translated. Saul nodded. Like he'd dropped a piano he'd been lugging on his back. And Mrs. Lamotte, Wolfe asked. Straight home, no stops. Assistant ditched her after a couple hours. Spent the night at some midtown bar, but he's clean. Miss Vance? Saul smiled slightly. Now that's interesting. She went to Brooklyn, visited an old warehouse, some kind of catering supply outfit. That closed last year. Empty building. Purpose? Wolfe asked. Couldn't see. She was inside for less than 5 minutes. Wolfe grunted. I leaned forward. So in one night, 2 suspects visited remote, unsupervised places where they could, say, stash evidence or destroy it. Exactly, Saul said. Wolfe tapped a finger against the armrest, a slow, measured rhythm. You said you saw no evidence carried? No, Saul said. If they moved something, it was either small or they'd hidden it before. Wolfe closed his eyes, thinking. I opened the envelope Saul had delivered and skimmed the contents. A preliminary background file on Henry Tuck, Danielle Vance, and Greta Lamotte. Nothing shocking, but a few juicy nuggets. Tuck was leveraged deep. Personal debts, 2 bad investments, and a pending lawsuit over a failed wine bar venture. Danielle had no criminal record but had filed a harassment claim 2 years ago against a previous employer, quietly settled. Greta Lamotte, surprise, surprise, was sitting on a crumbling empire. The brasserie was bleeding money faster than the Titanic took on water, despite the facade of high society glamour. Pressure, financial and personal, everywhere you looked. After Saul left, Wolfe poured himself a second beer, unusual for mid-morning, and finally spoke. Something has shifted, he said. The tasting last night accelerated fear. And fear, I said, picking up the thread, makes people stupid. He nodded. But we still don't know, I added. What exactly is missing? Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Shall? At that moment the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's residence, Archie Goodwin speaking. A woman's voice, tight with panic. Danielle Vance. Mr. Goodwin, please. You have to come. It's urgent. Slow down, I said. What's the trouble? There was a ragged breath on the other end. My apartment. Someone broke in. That got my attention. When? Just now. I went out for groceries. Came back. The door was forced. Everything tossed. You call the cops? A hesitation. No, I didn't know if I should, which told me she was more afraid of the wrong kind of police attention than she was of losing a few valuables. I'm on my way, I said. Sit tight. I hung up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. Report immediately, Wolfe said. His voice brooked no argument. Of course, I said, and got moving. Danielle's apartment looked like a hurricane had auditioned for a role in a disaster movie. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. The lock a twisted mess of splintered wood and metal. Inside, drawers were overturned, couch cushions sliced open, cabinets emptied onto the floor. Danielle stood in the center of the chaos, arms wrapped, tight around herself, looking about as steady as a house of cards in a strong wind. Don't touch anything, I said automatically, stepping around a pile of shredded mail. First rule. I didn't, she whispered. I just stood here. Good, let me look. It took 10 minutes to do a preliminary scan. Whoever had done it knew what they were after. They hadn't wasted time grabbing electronics or jewelry. They went for papers, files, books, anything that might hide a secret. What's missing? I asked. She shook her head, helpless. I don't know. Nothing valuable, I think. Just private things. Think carefully, I said. Was there anything connected to Florian? Recipes, menus, notes? Another beat of hesitation. Then, there's a notebook, she said. One I kept from my first time working under him. Recipes, schedules, things he taught. Me. Was it here? In the bookshelf, she said, pointing. The bookshelf was a gutted skeleton now, and the notebook, obviously, was gone. And would that notebook, I asked carefully, have any record of the spice blend Florian used at the Lamotte? Her face drained of color. Yes, she whispered. Bingo. Somebody had wanted that notebook very badly. I made a quick call to Lon Cohen at the Gazette and had him leak a whisper into the city gossip columns. Rumor of a missing document related to the Lamotte food scandal, a potential exoneration for Florian Descol. I didn't know if the thief would read it directly, but the grapevine in New York runs faster than a subway rat at closing time. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, lips pressed, into a grim line. The notebook was the target, I confirmed. He nodded, unsurprised. And now, Wolfe said, we have a thief. A thief who thinks they've erased the threat, I said. Or maybe plans to use it. Either way, Wolfe said, They have exposed themselves. How? He smiled, thin and cold. Only someone who knew the notebook existed could have sought it. I sat down heavily. Which means one of our guests last night. He nodded again. And now, he said, we shall close the net. By Monday morning, Wolfe had gone into full tactical mode. If you're picturing him rushing around waving blueprints and barking orders, you need a better imagination. Wolfe's version of all-out war was subtle, slow, and so quiet it made you itchy. He simply sat in his chair, his head tipped back, eyes closed, lips moving now and then in silent calculations. Around him, the brownstone was the real battlefield. I worked the phones, Saul Panzer worked the streets, and Fritz circulated quietly with coffee and sandwiches, like we were generals stuck in a bunker. At 11 sharp, Wolfe opened his eyes and spoke, his voice sharp as a scalpel. Archie. Telephone Mr. Tuck. Inform him that Mrs. Lamotte has been invited here tomorrow morning at 10, and it would be wise for him to attend as well. I nodded, reaching for the phone. And Miss Vance, Wolfe continued. Tell her I require a brief meeting. Today, immediate. I raised an eyebrow. Setting the stage already? He grunted. Priming the mechanism. I made the calls. Tuck was wary but agreed after some hemming and hawing about his packed schedule. Translation. He was afraid not to know what Greta Lamotte might say. Danielle Vance was more straightforward. She agreed to come by that afternoon, her voice still carrying the raw nerves from the break-in. By 1 o'clock, she was seated in Wolfe's office, hands tightly clasped in her lap. Miss Vance, Wolfe said, leaning back in his chair, you have been treated with intolerable impudence. Danielle gave a brittle laugh. That's one way of putting it. You did not report the intrusion to the police, Wolfe continued. Why? She shifted. Because I was afraid it would drag Florian's name further through the mud. And your own, Wolfe added dryly. She flushed. He studied her a moment, then said, The stolen notebook contained recipes, yes? Yes, she said, voice thin. Did it include the specific spice blend involved in the recent incident at Lamotte? Her shoulders sagged. A variation, from years ago, but close enough. Wolfe nodded, as if a particularly slow student had finally grasped the obvious, and that, he said softly, is the key. He let that hang for a moment before continuing. I require one thing from you, Miss Vance. Obedience. Danielle blinked, startled. Obedience. You must follow my instructions precisely, Wolfe said. No improvisation, no deviation. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. Good. Archie will dictate a short statement for you to deliver to Mr. Tuck today. Today? She squeaked. Yes. You will tell him, Wolfe said, that you have discovered a duplicate of the missing notebook, that you intend to deliver it to Mr. Goodwin for safekeeping this evening. Danielle's mouth dropped open. But there is no duplicate. Wolfe actually smiled, thin and predatory. Precisely. It took 15 minutes to drill the script into Danielle's head until she could recite it without stumbling. Then I escorted her out, making sure no curious neighbors saw too much. When I returned, Wolfe was dictating a short note to Saul. Trail Henry Tuck tonight. Watch for sudden movements. It was a simple plan, deceptively so. Wave a red flag in front of the bull and watch who charged. The trap was baited. That evening, I perched in the front room with a magazine I didn't bother reading, one eye on the street outside. Saul was stationed a block away in a battered sedan, looking like a man waiting for a date who wasn't going to show. At 9:30, the call came in. Movement, Saul said. Tuck just left his apartment, carrying something. Headed east. Stay on him, I said. I'll follow up. I grabbed my coat and made for the garage. Wolfe's orders were clear. Stay alert, stay distant, and don't intervene unless things got ugly. By the time I caught up, Saul had trailed Tuck to a grimy part of Queens near the river. Lots of warehouses, empty lots, forgotten corners where the city pretended it didn't exist. From a side street we watched Tuck park under a busted street lamp. He got out carrying a slim package wrapped in brown paper. "That him?" Saul asked low. "That's him," I said. We watched as Tuck approached a darkened building, tried a side door, found it locked, cursed softly. Then he pulled a key from his pocket and let himself in. I exchanged a look with Saul. "Friend of the neighborhood?" I said. "Or owner?" Saul muttered. We waited. 10 minutes. 15. At 20, Tuck reappeared, minus the package. He slipped back into his car and drove away, casual as a Sunday driver. We didn't follow immediately. Wolfe's orders were to retrieve, not confront. Once we were sure he was gone, Saul jimmied the side door open with a tool he wasn't supposed to own, and we slipped inside. The building was gutted, bare beams and concrete echoing our footsteps. But, tucked behind a crumbling partition wall, we found it. A hastily improvised hidey hole. Inside, the brown paper package. Untouched. Saul held it up. "You want to open it?" "Later," I said. Chain of custody and all that. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, face alight with a quiet, terrible satisfaction. I placed the package on his desk. With a surgeon's precision, Wolfe unwrapped it. Inside was a battered leather-bound notebook, Danielle's, or rather, what Henry Tuck thought was Danielle's. Wolfe turned a few pages, nodding. "Forgery," he said. "Yeah?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. He pointed at the writing. Different hand. Similar style. But not identical. I whistled low. Tuck tried. "To fabricate evidence, or destroy it," Wolfe said. "In either case, guilt is implicit. And Mrs. Lamotte?" He closed the notebook carefully. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall complete the operation." I grinned. Tomorrow was when Wolfe summoned the suspects. Tomorrow was when Nero Wolfe lowered the final boom. Tuesday morning broke sharp and clear, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside the brownstone, everything was arranged with Wolfe's usual merciless precision. The windows were cracked just enough to let in air, but not noise. The chairs were angled exactly to control sight lines and conversation flow. The notebooks were stacked, the beer chilled, and Fritz had even ironed the linen coasters. At 9:50, I checked the front room setup one last time. Wolfe was already seated behind his desk, plump hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair, as immovable as ever. The bell rang at 9:57. First in was Henry Tuck, as slick and polished as ever. But today there was an extra layer of tightness to him, like he was wearing a starched shirt 2 sizes too small. Danielle Vance arrived next, looking pale but determined, a slim folder clutched to her chest, as if it might shield her from incoming. Artillery Greta Lamotte, true to form, appeared last, sweeping in like a minor head of state, her assistant trailing dutifully behind with a clipboard and a 1,000-yard stare. I led them into the office and gestured to the chairs. Tuck sat immediately, choosing a seat with his back to the wall. Danielle hesitated, choosing one nearest the door while Greta declined altogether, choosing to stand near the bookcase, one hand wrapped elegantly around her wrist. Wolfe surveyed them all like a lion regarding a selection of particularly irritating prey. "Thank you for attending," he said, voice low and unhurried. "Your cooperation is both noted and appreciated." Henry gave a tight smile. Danielle just nodded. Greta remained silent, a sphinx in silk. "I have convened you," Wolfe continued, "because the matter involving Mr. Florian Descol is approaching resolution. The facts, though obscured by certain recent aunt activities, are now sufficiently clear." He paused to let that sink in. Across the room, Henry Tuck's knuckles whitened against his chair arms. I kept my face neutral. I'd seen better poker faces on bargain bin mannequins. "Before we proceed," Wolfe said, "I must advise you, anyone, Wishing to make a statement now, unsolicited, may do so. Silence. Greta's assistant fidgeted, earning a sharp look from his boss. Danielle shifted slightly but said nothing. Tuck licked his lips but stayed mute. Very well then. Wolfe pressed a button on his desk, signaling me. I stepped forward and placed the fake notebook, the one Saul and I had retrieved from the Queen's hidey hole, carefully on Wolfe's desk. 2 nights ago, Wolfe said, Miss Vance's apartment was burglarized. A notebook of personal culinary notes was stolen. Danielle blinked rapidly, but stayed silent. Wolfe continued. Yesterday evening, Mr. Goodwin recovered this notebook, hidden, in an abandoned building leased under a shell company. A company we now know tied financially to Mr. Tuck. Henry shifted, then forced a laugh. That's absurd, he said. Coincidence? Coincidence, Wolfe echoed dryly. That you visited the building last night? Henry's mouth opened and closed. I remind you, Wolfe said gently, silence may be misinterpreted. Henry leaned forward, face flushing. Even if I did visit that building, that proves nothing, no crime. Wolfe's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Not theft, he agreed. Merely tampering, fabrication, destruction of evidence, crimes of conscience, if not of statute. Greta Lamott spoke for the first time, voice brittle. This is all very theatrical, Mr. Wolfe, but you have no proof Florian Descole was innocent. I disagree, Wolfe said. The key lies not in the contamination itself, but in the timing. He leaned forward slightly, and the room seemed to shrink. The spice blend implicated in the incident, he said, was a specific variation Florian taught years ago. However, that variation was no longer in use and had not been for over 2 years. Danielle gasped softly. Tuck paled. Greta narrowed her eyes. Wolfe continued smoothly. Only someone who had access to Florian's old notes could have manufactured the sabotage. And who, I cut in, knew about those notes? Wolfe lifted a finger, counting. Mr. Descole, naturally. Miss Vance, who preserved a copy, and... He paused, savoring it. Mr. Tuck, who sought to steal or destroy that copy once he realized its significance. Henry surged to his feet. You're twisting things, he barked. You have no proof. Proof? Wolfe said. His voice was suddenly louder, sharper. The proof is your panic. Your desperate attempt to eliminate the notebook, your foolish reliance on Miss Vance's supposed naivete. Henry opened his mouth, closed it, sat down heavily. Greta Lamott folded her arms. Even if Mr. Tuck acted improperly, that does not absolve Descole. No, Wolfe said softly. But it implicates you, Mrs. Lamott. Her head jerked back like a snake striking in reverse. You knew the brasserie was failing, Wolfe said. You needed an excuse to sever ties with old loyalties. To protect your dwindling empire, you needed a scapegoat, someone convenient, someone with a reputation volatile enough to make the story believable. Greta said nothing, but her nails dug into her wrist, whitening the skin. You allowed Tuck to maneuver, Wolfe continued. Perhaps you even encouraged it. You needed Descole, discredited swiftly and absolutely, preferably without too much public inquiry. Across the room, Danielle Vance was staring at Greta, horror blooming on her face. It was a business decision, Wolfe said. Cold, ruthless, but necessary from your view. Greta lifted her chin. You cannot prove any of this. No, Wolfe said, and I have no intention of trying. Your reputation is already ruined. Any further action would only hasten the inevitable. He glanced at Henry. And you, Mr. Tuck, you have signed your own professional death warrant. Henry slumped in his chair, face gray. Wolfe exhaled heavily, as if washing his hands of the whole sordid affair. You may go. For a second no one moved. Then Greta Lamott turned on her heel and strode out, the assistant scrambling after her. Henry followed, shuffling like a man headed for his own execution. Danielle lingered, wide-eyed. You mean, she whispered. "It's over?" Wolfe grunted. "It is." She choked out a laugh, part relief, part disbelief, and fled. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving silence in its wake. I let out a low whistle. "Not bad," I said. "You practically gutted them with a fork," Wolfe snorted and reached for the bell to summon Fritz for beer. "It was not difficult," he said. "Ambition leaves fingerprints wider than any criminal record." I flopped into the red leather chair and kicked my feet up. "Maybe so," I said, "but ambition sure does make lousy soup." Wolfe smiled thinly, and for a moment the brownstone too seemed to exhale. A storm weathered, a balance restored. Dinner would be served soon, and for once it might even taste sweet. After the suspects cleared out, silence settled into the brownstone like dust. Fritz, sensing the tension's retreat, delivered Wolfe's beer without comment, setting it down with the reverence of a sacrament. I fetched a glass for myself, strictly water, since someone had to keep their head clear, and planted myself back in my favorite chair. For a few minutes Wolfe said nothing. Minutes. Wolfe. He simply sat, absorbing the stillness, letting the world outside fade to an irrelevant hum. He often needed a moment like that after a confrontation, not because it cost him effort. No, for Wolfe, unraveling lies was as natural as breathing, but because the stupidity of people wore on him like rough wool. Finally he spoke, low and precise. "Ambition," he said, "is a greater danger to order than malevolence." I leaned back, folding my arms. "I thought greed was the usual culprit." "Greed is merely a branch," Wolfe said. "Ambition is the root. It justifies any betrayal, excuses any cruelty, camouflages any cowardice." He took a sip of his beer. "In their way," he continued, "Tuck and Lamotte are more pitiable than despicable. They would call what they did survival." "And Florian Descole?" I asked. "Where does he land in your grand taxonomy of human folly?" Wolfe's mouth curved faintly. "Descole was a casualty," he said. "Collateral damage in a struggle he didn't even know he was fighting." "And Danielle?" "More fortunate," Wolfe said. "Thanks to you, and to herself, intelligence tempered by loyalty. A rare combination." I grinned. "I'll let her know she made the grade." He waved a hand. "Don't. Praise is dangerous. It encourages expectation." I chuckled. Typical Wolfe. The only thing stingier than his compliments was his exercise regimen. The clock on the wall ticked into the early evening. "So," I said, "what's next?" "Nothing," Wolfe said contentedly. "The case is concluded. Justice has been administered, not by law, perhaps, but by consequence. We have no further obligation." I tilted my head. "No report to the police?" "No," Wolfe said. "No formal charges, no scandal. Merely the slow erosion of reputation and fortune, more fitting." I didn't argue. Wolfe hated unnecessary entanglements almost as much as he hated leaving his chair. Just then the phone rang. I answered. Naturally it was Fritz calling from the kitchen. "Dinner is ready," he said. I looked at Wolfe. He inclined his head regally, like a king granting an audience to his own appetite. We adjourned to the dining room, where Fritz had prepared a meal that looked suspiciously like a victory lap. Pheasant, roasted in cognac, sautéed green beans with almonds, and a towering croquembouche for dessert. As we ate, Wolfe was unusually talkative. For him, he discussed the finer points of spice blends, the impossibility of fully replicating a chef's intuition, and the folly of trying to bottle artistry for profit. Fritz listened, beaming, because Wolfe's approval, when it came, was like a papal blessing. I chipped in the occasional wisecrack, just to keep the mood from getting too philosophical. After all, if you let Wolfe, he'd turn every meal into a Socratic seminar. When dessert arrived, Wolfe eyed the croquembouche like a man evaluating a mountain he might actually consider climbing. It was a golden tower of pastry and spun sugar, and Fritz had even nestled tiny candied violets between the puffs. Wolfe helped himself to a generous portion, which in Wolf speak was practically an act of acrobatics. Between bites, he delivered his final verdict on the case. The most dangerous trait, he said, is not hatred or envy or even greed. He set his fork down, his eyes sharp over the rim of his glass. It is certainty, he said, the unshakable belief that one's desires are righteous. I chewed that over along with my pastry. Pretty words, I said, but not much comfort for Florian Descole. He will recover, Wolfe said. Fritz will see to it. He was right. Fritz had already called Florian earlier that afternoon, after Wolfe gave the nod. The chef would come to the brownstone for dinner in a few days, privately, away from scandal. Fritz would cook, Wolfe would eat, and Florian would be reminded that dignity wasn't awarded by the public. It was preserved among friends. I leaned back, savoring the last forkful of sugar and dough. You know, I said, for a man who never leaves his chair, you sure manage to shake up the world when you want to. Wolfe grunted, unimpressed. Motion, he said, is not progress. And stillness, I asked, is power, he said simply. I filed that one away. Wolfe's philosophy was a tricky beast, but every so often he dropped a line that stuck like a burr in your brain. Dinner wound down. Wolfe retreated to his office for his postprandial ritual. Beer, a book, and maybe a few choice insults hurled silently at the wider world. I lingered in the dining room, helping Fritz clear plates. The brownstone had returned to its natural state. Orderly, predictable, safe. No more burglars tearing through the kitchen. No more poisoned spice blends. No more desperate guests tracking mud onto the Persian rugs. Just the low hum of life, steady and unshaken. Exactly how Wolfe liked it. I carried the last tray into the kitchen and paused at the door, taking a long look at the brownstone, at the gleam of polished wood, the muted gold of lamplight, the faint smell of orchids from the upstairs rooms. Not bad, I thought. Not bad at all. As I turned off the light, I muttered to myself, maybe justice isn't a flaming sword, I smiled. Maybe sometimes it's just a fat man in a yellow chair, telling the world to sit down and shut up. And for once the world listened, absolutely. Let's give it a full, satisfying 1,200-word wrap-up, true to the format. 2 days after the case, cracked open like a soft-boiled egg, the brownstone slipped back into its old rhythms. Fritz was humming in the kitchen again. The orchids were getting spritzed and coddled like royalty, and Wolfe had returned to his books and beer, happily ignoring the rest of the city's sordid nonsense. To put it bluntly, peace had been restored. And if you know Wolfe, you know peace wasn't just a preference, it was a constitutional right. But peace, like everything else in New York, was temporary. At 4 in the afternoon, Fritz poked his head into the office and announced, with barely contained excitement, "Mr. Descole has arrived." Wolfe, buried in a monograph about 18th-century hybrid orchids, grunted approval without looking up. I strolled to the front door and let Florian in. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, less haunted, a bit more color in his cheeks. But there was still a tightness around his eyes that said the past month had shaved a few years off his life expectancy. "Mr. Goodwin," he said warmly. "And Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe waved a hand, signaling him to come in. Florian did, carefully, as if half expecting a trap to spring from the parquet floor. I led him to the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, the one reserved for clients, suspects, and occasionally grateful survivors. Fritz followed with a tray, a pot of coffee, a small bottle of cognac, and a plate of Fritz's almond pistachio biscotti, Florian's favorite, naturally. "So you are safe here," Wolfe said simply, settling back into his chair. "Eat, drink." Florian did, like a man tasting freedom for the first time. After a few bites and a swallow of coffee dosed with cognac, he set the cup down and looked squarely at Wolfe. "I owe you," he said. "I owe you more than I can say." Wolfe shook his head. You owe Fritz. I merely performed my function. Florian stopped, shook his head, and laughed softly. Function or not, you salvaged what little reputation I have left. He hesitated. I don't know if the world will let me come back, he said, but you gave me a chance. Wolfe studied him for a long moment. The world, he said finally, is not our concern. Only our own standards. I could have framed that one and hung it over the mantel. Florian stayed for another hour, swapping quiet stories with Fritz, discussing recipes, kitchen disasters, old battles with overbearing restaurant owners. Wolfe listened, occasionally grunting, approval or offering a withering observation about the restaurant industry's penchant for self-destruction. At 6 o'clock, Florian rose. I should go, he said, but thank you. He shook Wolfe's hand, a rare honor, and clapped me on the shoulder like an old comrade. Then he was gone, swallowed up by the city outside, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and hope. After Florian's departure, Wolfe retreated to the plant rooms, leaving me free to take up my regular evening duties, clearing correspondence, scanning Lon Cohen's latest scribbles in the Gazette for potential headaches, and keeping one ear cocked for any signs of imminent domestic collapse. Around 8, as I was sharpening pencils, one of those chores that sounds optional but wasn't, not if you wanted to live, Wolfe buzzed for me from the plant room. I went up. He was among the orchids, tenderly misting a rare Miltonia with a sprayer shaped like a medieval instrument of torture. Archie, he said without turning. Here, I said, leaning against the doorframe. He finished with the Miltonia, turned and fixed me with his usual scowl that, after all these years, had worn down to something almost affectionate. You have done well, he said. I blinked. Wolfe wasn't stingy with money, but compliments. They had to be pried out of him with a crowbar and a subpoena. Thank you, I said solemnly, because when Wolfe handed you a real compliment, you didn't wisecrack. Not immediately, anyway. He nodded. The case, he said, was instructive. Instructive how? I asked, curious. He gestured broadly at the greenhouse. Here, he said, everything grows according to its nature. It does not lie, it does not betray. He turned back to the orchids, misting another bloom. Human beings, he said, are less honest, but no less predictable. I watched him work for a moment, his bulk surprisingly gentle among the delicate stems. And what's the lesson? I asked. He smiled faintly, the mist catching the light like a halo around his head. A ridiculous image if there ever was one. The lesson, Wolfe said, is simple. He turned to me again. Trust behavior, not words. I nodded, filing it away. And what about ambition? I asked. You said it was more dangerous than hatred. Indeed, he said, ambition blinds. It convinces men and women they are exceptions to natural law, that their needs justify disruption, betrayal, even ruin. He shook his head slowly. In this house, he said, there is order. No ambition will penetrate it. I had to smile at that. Except yours, I said. He gave me a look, a mixture of exasperation and amusement that was as close to a wink as Wolfe ever got. Bah, he said, I am ambitious for nothing but peace and satisfaction. He turned back to his orchids. I left him there, misting the blooms with the careful attention most men reserve for ticking bombs, and went downstairs to the office. Outside, the city growled and spun, a creature too big, too hungry, too restless ever to be tamed. But inside the brownstone, the world made sense again. Rules were enforced. Justice, however oddly served, was satisfied, and dinner would, as always, be on. Time. I settled into the red chair, poured myself a drink, and kicked up my feet. The world might be crazy. But here, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I grinned to myself and said aloud to the empty room, "Not bad for a fat man and his wisecracking sidekick, and if the walls of the brownstone chuckled back, well, I wasn't telling." The brownstone had settled back into its usual rhythm. By afternoon, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen had given way to Fritz's humming, soft and steady. The orchids were still being misted with care, the plants tucked in their corners like soldiers at rest, and Wolfe, of course, had resumed his perpetual battle with the written word. Only the scent of fresh coffee and the occasional rustling of papers interrupted the quiet. I was perched in my chair, staring at a stack of legal nonsense from the Gazette, and wondering if the world would be better if I simply erased it all with one well-placed match. But that was a daydream for another time. At precisely 5 o'clock the doorbell rang. The sound of the chimes, sharp and familiar, broke my reverie. I glanced at Wolfe. He didn't move, didn't even blink. "Another visitor, I presume," I said, not expecting any surprise. "Indeed," Wolfe replied without lifting his eyes from the book in front of him. "See to it." I rolled my eyes, got up, and opened the door. It was, unsurprisingly, Saul Panzer, looking as unruffled as always, unless, of course, you caught him just before he had to jump through a window to avoid an argument. "Saul," I said, "what's the good word?" He stepped inside with a small envelope, handing it to me without ceremony. "This is for Mr. Wolfe. I've just been informed of a development, and I thought you'd want to see it before it hits the papers." Took the envelope and headed upstairs. Saul trailed me into Wolfe's study. "What's the story?" Wolfe took the envelope, opened it with methodical care, and scanned the contents. "The case is closed," Wolfe said in his typical calm manner. "For all intents and purposes." I looked at him. "What's that mean?" He set the papers down carefully, his eyes gleaming with the kind of quiet satisfaction that only Wolfe could pull off after a case ended in his favor. "Miss Vance has confirmed something I suspected," Wolfe continued. "Greta Lamotte did not merely manipulate the situation from behind the scenes. She financed the fabrication of the alleged duplicate notebook." "Meaning?" "She paid for the forgery?" I asked. Wolfe nodded, taking a slow, deliberate sip of beer. "Exactly. The whole affair with the missing document, the proof that Florian had sabotaged the event, was orchestrated to deflect attention from her own financial failures. Descole was simply the scapegoat she needed." I glanced at the papers again, but they didn't offer any new revelations. "So she was the one pulling the strings all along." Wolfe exhaled heavily. "Not quite. Mrs. Lamotte and Mr. Tuck acted out of greed and fear, but the real culprit, if one is to be labeled as such, is ambition. Theirs and Descole's, which turned out to be even more dangerous than I had anticipated." I thought about that for a moment. "You're telling me that Descole was just an unfortunate pawn caught in a web of power games?" Wolfe smiled thinly. "Indeed. He was the unintentional victim in a very deliberate play. Fortunately, his loyalty to Miss Vance kept him from being entirely consumed by the forces at work around him." I sat back, the weight of it all settling over me. And the rest of it, the tampered spice blend, the break-in at Vance's apartment, Tuck's missteps, those were all part of Lamotte's grand design to keep everyone pointing at each other. Wolfe nodded. "Correct. A delicate balance of manipulation, deception, and plausible deniability, but in the end it was her own paranoia that unraveled her." I smiled. A bit of irony there. Wolfe allowed himself the faintest of grins. "Indeed." There was a long silence, one of those comfortable stretches where Wolfe could simply enjoy the satisfaction of having his deductions validated, while I mulled over the intricacies of the case. Finally, Wolfe spoke again. "I have no intention of turning this into a public spectacle. The matter is closed, and the perpetrators, while guilty, will have to suffer their consequences privately." I raised an eyebrow. "A man of mercy, are we?" Wolfe's expression softened, just enough to let me know I was prying into a deeper side of his nature. Mercy, Archie, is often a far more significant punishment than the visible consequences of the law. I thought about that for a second, then nodded. It made sense in that slow, intellectual way Wolfe was so adept at. Well, I said, getting up from my chair, I suppose that's the end of it. Another case closed. Wolfe made a dismissive sound. Another problem solved, perhaps. The cases are endless and the people who create them never quite learn. I gave him a grin. Same old Wolfe. Never one to soften up the human race. Why would I? He asked, taking another sip of beer. There is no satisfaction in pity, only in solving the puzzle. I paused at the door, glancing back at him. You know, for someone who says he's just interested in puzzles, you've got a very detailed way of making sure the pieces fit perfectly. It's almost like you have a little vested interest in people getting what they deserve. Wolfe didn't reply, but his eyes twinkled, and I could see the faintest hint of amusement tug at his lips. The silent answer, as always, was his most eloquent one. With the case wrapped up and the last pieces falling into place, the brownstone returned to its default state of controlled calm. The books lined the shelves, the orchids bloomed and faded in their seasons, and Fritz's kitchen was once again the realm of carefully prepared dishes rather than criminal schemes. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a small satisfaction in knowing that Wolfe's mind, while sedentary in body, had once again outmaneuvered the chaotic currents of the world outside. Dinner was served, and while the meal wasn't without its usual culinary flair, it was the quiet certainty of justice that lingered with me longer than any wine or course. Another successful resolution, I muttered as I looked at Wolfe, and another case of cold intellectual justice served on a silver platter. Wolfe raised his glass, his expression unchanged. You're learning, Archie, he said with a thin smile. And I couldn't help but respond in kind, knowing that there was no end to the cases Wolfe would solve, or the lessons he would impart. It was, after all, his way, the only way.